Well, like Tyler, this isn't necessarily going to be a story that ends up with a happy ending. But I wanted to tell the story anyway, because I think there are several morals to the story that we can learn from. So this is our team. It's a really mixed team of people with a technology background like myself, Stephen, who represented Alberta Health Services. So he represented the healthcare system who had a need that was identified along with his clinical colleague, Tessa, and then three computer science students that had never even thought about a wheelchair in their life. And so one of the benefits of taking this project on, as I saw it, was to expose our computer science students to the field of rehabilitation and the challenges of that we face around wheelchairs. So that was the background to the story. And just my disclosure is that it was partially funded for the student stipends by Alberta Health Services and also by my lab and by the computing science department. So everyone pitched in a little bit of cash. So in Alberta, this is the way things work. And I don't think it's so dramatically different from the way it works in the States, in that in this particular case, the government has a ministry, which is the Ministry of Health. And that ministry is responsible for a program, which is the Alberta AIDS for Daily Living program. So remember, everyone thinks of Canada having a healthcare system. It does not. It has a provincial healthcare system. And so that means that each province does it their own way against a broad set of rules that were established in the Canada Health Act. So the way that it's done in Alberta isn't necessarily the way it's done elsewhere in Canada. But I think it's an easily understood model where on the other side of the story, what we have are people who, for example, are occupational therapists predominantly in Canada who do the wheelchair assessment. And often, and this is the starting point of this story, that person isn't necessarily particularly experienced in the field of wheelchairs. So they're generalist, if you like, occupational therapist who has encountered a patient that they feel needs a wheelchair, and now they've got to do something about it. So in the conventional context where the starting point of the story was, they will make a referral to an approved product supplier where a product specialist, that's someone with the technical knowledge around wheelchairs, will be present, and an AADL clinician, that's someone who's been trained to a certain level in the process of wheelchair assessment, and they're a clinician. And so that's the established mechanism. And then basically they come up with a solution that they want to recommend for their client, and they send the bill to get approval from AADL. And if they don't fully approve it, then the client is, if they wish, able to top up the costs so that they can get what they want with supplementary funding or insurance funding or whatever. So that's the story. And then what happened was, as a consequence of COVID, we had a supply chain problem in that wheelchairs were becoming hard to get. And this was a particularly challenging problem for people with relatively simple requirements in terms of wheelchairs. So a lot of these folks are people in continuing care who need a wheelchair. We're not really necessarily talking about the very active wheelchair user, the more complex, sophisticated wheelchair. So what they thought was, we'll establish a recycling program so that the wheelchairs can come back into a sort of quasi-central repository. We'll keep an inventory of these, and then we can redistribute them. And that would be the model that we use going forward. And that was intended to take things out of landfill, reduce costs, speed up delivery. Those were the motivations. So the difficulty with that model is that, as you saw in that original slide, in a normal brand new wheelchair prescription, the vendor will be present with the technical expertise to know how to put all the bits and pieces together on the wheelchair so that it all works. In this model, they have no incentive to be there because they're not able to charge for that. And so what happened was, I think the next slide shows this sort of change in the situation. So what we have now is that occupational therapist who doesn't know that much about wheelchairs now being required to decide out of the recycling pool what is the best one that might work for their client, and not have that technology specialist available to help them get the configuration right. They were super uncomfortable about being placed in that position. And so pretty well top down, Alberta AIDS for Daily Living said, in that case, we will produce a decision aid to help you. And it will be a software aid to do that. And so Alberta Health Services came to us and said, well, will you develop a decision aid for us that could do it? And remembering that would be a very simple set of wheelchairs that you would be drawing from. So we said we'd give it a try and see how it works out. And so this is the way the model would work with the decision aid in the picture. I had significant reservations about this. I think I know enough about this field of assistive technology and wheelchair provision to know that there's so many snags in trying to go about something like this. But on the other hand, I felt, well, why not? Let's see where it takes us. The very minimum we get out of this is those computer scientists learn something about wheelchairs, which is a whole lot better than a lot of the gaming work that they were doing. So that was my primary motivation, but I was also intrigued to see whether there was any possibility of making it work. And so I've just told you that. So if you put yourself in that OT's position, and most of you here at ISS will know all about this, a lot more than I do, this is actually a pretty challenging problem. You're faced with one of these forms, which is a description, if you like, of a product. And you're expected to sort of link a whole series of measurements and observations about your client to all sorts of characteristics of different wheelchairs that are available and find the perfect match and get it right first time. And if you're not doing that on a daily basis, that's a really challenging problem. On the other hand, if you think about Amazon or something like that, then they use filters like this all the time. In other words, you're looking for a particular kind of product, and then they'll narrow it down until you find the product you're actually looking for. So the way we were thinking about this was, well, let's think about it rather like an Amazon-like approach, where we would have an assessment form at the beginning, which would have the basic information about the client, remembering this is a simple client, and then try to filter that down to products that actually would likely do the job. So that was the idea. So we went through a pretty reasonable consultation process at the beginning. This was all done in 4 months, probably less than 4 months. So, you know, the consultation process was a number of Zoom calls. We were in the middle of COVID, but it was enough, I think, to really get a good understanding about what an acceptable solution would look like. One of the things we had to take into account was that Aids for Daily Living has basically a list of approved products. And so we didn't have everything under the sun that we could draw upon. We had to really work with that narrow set of products. And so much like you would in the US, there are codes that are associated with those products. And so you can match, you know, specifications to code and code to product. And so that was the sort of nature of it. And so what we also had to do is to make sure ultimately this solution was something that was bespoke to Alberta. And so we looked around to see if there were any other similar decision aids available. We didn't find anything that was exactly what we were looking for. And then I'm going to finish the story by telling you something very funny about this afternoon. But anyway, we've decided we were justified in building something. And so we went ahead with that consultation process, worked with the leadership of AADL, worked with existing authorizers who knew the ropes, and also with those less experienced OTs, and came up with a team. Essentially, the team represents, as you can see in this slide, you know, at the top end, the AADL clinician, the expert wheelchair fitting clinician, if you like. In the middle are our computer scientists, which incorporate a full stack developer who can sort of integrate the front end and the back end of the software. The back-end developer that essentially develops the algorithm and the filters, and the front-end developer that looks after, you know, the user interface and making it friendly and filling in the boxes, and then overall project management. And so what they came up with was something that looks a little bit like this. And so this is the client assessment form. And you can see that there are, I haven't got the whole thing here, but there are a number of boxes that you can complete that describe some of the key parameters that are needed in order to match the client to the product. One of the challenges with this sort of approach, and the more complex the wheelchairs become, the more challenging this becomes, is that wheelchairs are adjustable. So, you know, they're not just a fixed measurement. They're not just one, you know, seat to floor height, for example. There are different ways you can put things together by putting on different wheels or different axle plates and so on and so on. And, you know, the whole thing becomes a nightmare. At least it felt like a nightmare, you know, in terms of trying to go too far with this idea. And so that's the client assessment form. And then the app development architecture looks something like this. And I've just put this in to show that this is a non-trivial undertaking. there's a lot of stuff involved in terms of trying to make those different components work together so that you've got an architecture that is friendly enough to use, is robust, and meets various different privacy requirements that we're going to have because we're entering identifiable information into a database. And, these are some of the specifications you need for a server that's going to do that. So it's not just a sort of laptop sitting on somebody's desk, but you've got to have a server with a certain amount of capability to be able to deliver a system like this, especially when you start doing that at a provincial level. So we involved our Alberta Health Services IT team in this, and they helped with that. These are the different programming languages that were involved in developing this. So quite a lot of different components involved in the actual production of the application at the end of the day. So what happened at the end? So as we speak today, a very small number of wheelchair fittings have actually involved recycled equipment. The vendors are not showing up, quite understandably. They don't want to come because there's no financial reason for them to want to come. And I think as a consequence of that, and this is me sort of interpreting, the tea leaves a little bit, I think what has happened is that clinicians finding themselves in a situation where they're not supported by vendors and are not particularly familiar with a new technology that is being foisted upon them, are basically saying, I'm not even going to get into this. It's my way or the highway. So I'm extrapolating my thinking a little bit, but I suspect that's what's going on here. And I don't blame them. I think that's the nature of trying to do something like this. The adoption and implementation of any new technology and new ideas, even though they may have some merits, it's a very, very sensitive process. And currently extra sensitive because we're dealing with such workforce shortages and also significant clinical pressures in terms of volume. People are just not ready to do things in a particularly different way because they're clinging on. And that's the way it feels, at least where we are in terms of the clinical environment that we're working in. The other thing that didn't happen, and I put this firmly at the feet of the AADL folks, is, well, really you needed to create an inventory system and a distribution system if this is going to work. And if you didn't do that, it was never going to work. And they haven't done it. And so there's a chicken and egg learning there, right? And one is that, well, they probably didn't have the confidence that this was going to work in order for them to put the investment into creating that system. So at what point, what has to happen in order for those things to come together so that it would work? And then, as I said, there are the capacity issues that we have. And then what happened in the middle of all of that, for various other reasons, what we call clinical operations came in and said, we're not having our people working on all that stuff at the moment. They've got other priorities to get on with. Park it, okay? So it got parked. So on the other hand, we still have had positive feedback from a wide range of therapists. So they're not saying, this is just a crazy idea, forget it. But it's going to be an ongoing process of discussion and gradual implementation to see whether or not we take this any further. So the moral of the story is this is a really interesting one for me because my background is in biomedical engineering. So what do I do most of the time? Push technology onto people, right? Mostly unwillingly. I can't help it. I really struggle with it. In this case, this was an absolute pull. I was not pushing anything. I was being dragged along by the pull. And yet pull is not all sweetness and light. In that pull has its own challenges. And pull, if you're going to implement pull, needs to line itself up as well. It's not just that I would like to have, but it's much more I'm going to put some infrastructure around this pull so that we've got the right framework in order to give it the opportunity to succeed on the implementation and adoption side, and not just on the I've got a brand new sparkling piece of technology to use. So now, this is the funny thing that happened to me today at ISS. Walking through the exhibit hall, bumped into a screen that was there with a person standing by the side of it who looked kind of lonely. And it's a company called ArtsCo. And ArtsCo has created a decision aid that does a lot of the things that we're talking about. It's really well done in that they've done a huge amount of work on this. Irony is the developer of that and the owner of the company was a PhD student of mine from 30 years ago. And so everything goes around, comes around. But obviously, this is not an isolated idea in that although the recycling part might be a little isolated, the idea of a decision aid might be something that's helpful. And so that's our story. It's an ongoing story, but I thought it was worth sharing.